Nice.
None of us have yet seen an ideally perfect man, and yet, without that ideal, we cannot progress. Such were the words by the one of the greatest man that the land of India has known, Swami Vivekananda. Namaskar, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sahib Jeet Kaur, and it's an absolute delight for me to welcome you all to the 25th edition of the National Youth Festival. As we celebrate the 159th birth anniversary of a perpetual youth icon and visionary Swami Vivekananda, we also celebrate an idea today. Ladies and gentlemen, the idea to grow together as a nation through experience, to learn and to create through participation, and to learn from all what diversity has to offer. So, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining in today. Our sessions today will focus on the theme of national character, nation building, and homegrown change leaders. Before we move forward, ladies and gentlemen, I have a very interesting audio video that is the AV that I'd like to share with you. Can we have the AV, please? जीत मिले ना मिले ये अलग बात है जीत मिले ना मिले ये अलग बात है पर मैं कोशिश भी ना करूं ये तो गलत बात है Ladies and gentlemen, such were the heroes of our land, of our India. Well, moving on, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to begin with the inauguratory session. That's the first session for the day. And our topic is what modernity means for India, decoding the thoughts of Swami Vivekananda. And ladies and gentlemen, as his biographer and an acclaimed academic, our speaker for this session has a lot to share. Currently serving as vice president at Invest India and a former journalist, please welcome Hindol Sengupta as our speaker for this session. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, in conversation with Mr. Harsh Gupta Madhusudan, an expert in the field of economics, finance, and politics. And ladies and gentlemen, of course, is on the faultiness of these three significant fields. Let's get to know more about Swami Vivekananda from a fresh lens. So welcome, gentlemen. I hope you have a wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this wonderful, wonderful program, and also particularly delighted to be in conversation with my dear friend, Harsh Gupta Madhusudan.
Thank you.
We have great common interests, not least in the work of Swami Vivekananda, in history, in economics, and many other fields. Harsh, thank you for joining me on this.
Hindol, it's an absolute honor for me to be in this event and really humble me. It's actually my honor to speak with you. You have written about Swamiji, The Modern Monk, a book that I encourage everybody to read. So looking forward to this conversation.
I want to begin, thank you very much, Harsh. I want to begin by talking a little bit about the topic itself, modernity. In many minds, the idea of modernity and spiritual leaders don't go hand in hand. Spiritual leaders seem to talk to us from a distance. They are people who have, in a sense, distanced themselves from the day to day lives that we are all embroiled in. We think of spiritual leaders in their temples, in their monastic centers, maybe sometimes high in the mountains, leading a life that is entirely devoted to spiritual purposes and cut away in many ways from the day to day humdrum of life. Therefore, their idea, in a sense, we always think of as either conservative or eternal, the other word. But modernity is not something that we usually associate with spiritual leaders. But Swami Vivekananda was unique in the sense that he is really a Renaissance man. And this, Harsh, will speak to you also because you're also from Calcutta. And Calcutta was the home of the Bengal Renaissance. Vivekananda is really a Renaissance character, right? Here is a man who is hugely enthusiastic about cultures of the world. He avidly reads cookbooks from France, from America, from across Europe, diligently jots down recipes. When he's traveling around the world, he's diligently jotting down what the Americans eat, what the Europeans eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, comparing all that with Indian cuisine. He was a great foodie. Here is a man who's fluent in English, understands many other languages, of course, apart from Indian languages, engages with science and technology, is interested in shipbuilding, is interested in, at that time, as a subject of colonial India, interested in how weapons are manufactured, right? Interested in engineering. So if you look at Swami Vivekananda, and maybe we could begin there, he is that quintessential Renaissance man, a man who's excited about ideas.
No, absolutely. I think, Hindol, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. See, we have to first very quickly think about the word modernity itself. What does it mean? How do we kind of contextualize this Bengal Renaissance, Indian Renaissance, may I dare say, dharmic civilizational Renaissance? And I think modernity, one way of thinking about modernity is that where people are ready to let go their fixed space in society and economics, so their relative status, they're ready to risk that for a collective absolute gain. So that is the switch that goes from, say, pre-modernity to modernity, or some kind of feudal, static, agrarian system to the socioeconomic system, where things actually accelerate, where you are find that, okay, maybe I will let go of this relative status because I might, or my family might end up gaining more. In that situation, you actually need more spirituality, not less, because the pace of change is overwhelming. So we also have to distinguish between religion and spirituality. And therefore, it is not surprising that Bengal, which was one of the first areas to come in contact with the printing press on scale, with modern industry, also produced these great figures like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, who thought about it, who synthesized, and who had the confidence, as you were mentioning about him exploring Western dishes, who to face the West as an equal, but without any kind of burden of self-orientalizing, right? So it was not an Occidentalist vision. They would say that what you're doing with the Aboriginals is wrong, but Swamiji would also say, America, right now, you are the motherland of liberty. He would not feel in any way lessened by objectively noticing that in spirituality, right now, we are superior. But in terms of society, and I'm talking about 19th century, maybe the West has something to teach us as well. So I think that confidence, that balance, that vigor, it's a vigor which is not amoral. It's not a Nietzschean vigor. It's a vigor that go out and do something, but do not call yourself a victim. Do not be miserable about it. And I think that overall combination is what makes Swamiji, who had a relatively short life in terms of years, but in terms of impact, it makes him a personality par excellence. And I was mentioning your book. I was just reading that in other contexts. It's almost a dream. If you would not know that this man existed for sure, you would not necessarily believe it.
Absolutely. And you very beautifully put it. You see, I always talk in my lectures about Swami Vivekananda as Swami Vivekananda being an emblem of the confidence of the colonized. You see, we cannot forget that he was a resident, a national of a colonized country. He was living through colonization, which actually none of us can colonial country, most of us cannot even imagine, right? But he was a resident. He was born in and grew up in a colonized country. And Swami Vivekananda, yet, as you so beautifully put it, did not shed any confidence because of that. He was able to face the West indeed not only as an equal, but in many ways proclaim that India was superior, even though he was living in a colonized country. So he said that you shouldn't look at India from its that current moment, which is in the 19th century being colonized, right? You should look at India's long history and what India had to offer to the world. In fact, Swami Vivekananda, even in that moment, famously pointed out that his own university, Calcutta University, was joyfully admitting and graduating women long before the great universities of the West, including Oxford and Cambridge, and indeed universities in America. So, that's another thing, and we'll talk about gender in a bit. But in that, again, Swami Vivekananda showcases that he's confident not only about the ancient Vedic knowledge and the Upanishads and all the glorious things that India has to offer, but he even pointed out something in his current day that India had to be proud, could feel proud about, which is that in terms of offering knowledge, and of course, he was from a Renaissance period in Bengal's history. India was welcoming women as even in his own lifetime into education before the West did. So this combination of and this man really had nothing, right? I mean, he was impoverished for most of his life because, of course, he never chose to join a profession and make money. He was an ascetic, a monk, a sadhu for all his life. He always lived on alms and donations that people would give, and therefore lived a fairly impoverished life. And yet, his confidence of knowledge, his ability to speak at the highest stages in the world, speak to, and we forget that people who introduced him in America to the Parliament of Religions were Harvard professors, right? So he was talking to some of the elitist people in the West at their own level on his own terms. That is something incredible for us to learn. Even today, we say, "Oh, the burden of being colonized and all of that." But here was a man who was actually living in colonial times, and yet was refusing to allow it to girdlock him. That's something great to learn from Swami Vivekananda on breaking boundaries that seem unsurmountable. Right? That is this great thing to learn from Swami Vivekananda.
No, I fully agree. I think, there was a incipient universalism, obviously in Vedic thought, but which came back with Bengal Renaissance, which is very well exemplified by Swamiji. And, he once said about conquering the conquerors. He mentioned the earlier conquerors that in a way India had conquered. He mentioned that Britain has force of arms, but it is useless in the world of ideas. And he prophesies that eventually Britain would also be deeply positively impacted by Indian ideas, just like they were by the Renaissance, the rediscovery of Greco-Roman ideas. And you absolutely rightly mentioned about how he spoke about women. He mentioned in his talks the ancient sage Gargi and others, the Vedic sages. I mean, what is also interesting is not only was he confident to speak as an equal and where required, even talk, very politely down required to the West, but even internally in India, there was no kitsch. Kitsch is a beautiful word that Milan Kundera introduced. There was no kitsch to his religiosity. He would tell youngsters, forget about reading sacred books, you go and play football. Be strong first. And he told even more grown-up peers that for 50 years, let's first make sure India is free and the stomachs are full, because giving religious knowledge to people who are poor is basically insulting them. And again, that even internally that required confidence to say that, because then he had no fear of being so-called outflanked for his lack of religiosity. Such was the depth of his knowledge, which everybody acknowledged. So there was a dual pairing that he was doing, not only with the colonizers at their peak, the Anglo-Americans, who were literally the masters of the universe at the turn of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, but even internally he had the confidence to reimagine our traditions while keeping them rooted. And I think that such a massive oeuvre of achievements in such a short period, I think that is what makes him a timeless figure.
Absolutely. And people forget that even before Swamiji went abroad, people in classic way, I say in many of my lectures that even Swami Vivekananda had to go to America for many of his detractors to accept him in India. This classic Indian problem, right? But we forget, that's of course partly as a joke, but we forget that before he went to the West, he took time off to understand his own civilization, his own country. He spent a long time traveling, quite like Adi Shankaracharya himself, length and breadth of India. Swamiji traveled across the length and breadth of India, trying to understand his own nation. And therein lies, I think, another great idea. Most of us take enough time. So when, sometimes in my lectures, and I'm sure you've found this in your talks too, Harsh, sometimes when you mention certain things about India to even very knowledgeable audiences, they're astounded and befuddled that all of this exists in India, because we haven't taken our education system and our societal systems haven't given us the impetus to understand our own country and our own civilization and our own knowledge systems. Swamiji actually did that. And I must, as an aside, mention here, he, of course, had the same experience as Adi Shankaracharya, where, of course, a sort of so-called lower caste man comes to him. And his first instinct is to move away. And then immediately he realizes, in a moment of spiritual clarity, what am I doing? I cannot talk about the power of Advaita Vedanta, which inculcates the entire universe, and think there is a difference between man and man, right? And he immediately embraces the person, right? So he takes off time to really go and understand the country. And this is very important also because as India sends more and more of its children around the world and who they rise to, points of success around the world, it's very important to explain to younger people and people of our age and older that the only way these people will be confident abroad is if they have a confident background or confident roots at home. It is only when you're rooted that you can possibly aim to be free, right? Freedom comes from being rooted. People feel freedom comes from being uprooted. Swami Vivekananda showed that no, true freedom is about really having deep roots. That's when you can truly fly and be free, right? That's really, really important. Let's talk a little bit about gender. Sorry, Harsh, go on. You were about to say something.
No. I was just quickly adding to your excellent point there that actually Swamiji said that caste is a social institution and it has nothing to do with religion. And he mentions the figure of Buddha Shakyamuni, who was born in a Kshatriya background but became a monk. And he says that actually we need that combination of Hindu and Buddhist, and in some places he even mentioned Christian and Muslim ideas to make a beautiful universal world. One of the few books he carried, obviously after the Bhagavad Gita, while that during his peregrinations in India, as you mentioned, was a book called The Imitation of Christ. And if that did not make him a lesser Hindu in any way, because he was, as you said, very rooted in the clarity of plurality and multiplicity. So there was no question of him getting carried away by exclusivity. In fact, he was the biggest opponent of that. So once you have that clarity, then you can take the best ideas from anywhere without needing to kind of show that, oh, no, I'm running away from it. So that confidence brings about a small L liberality and small c Catholicity, which I think Swamiji exemplified very well. So please go ahead on the gender point.
Yes, absolutely. And, Swamiji's own guru, and as a side, I must mention, Sri Ramakrishna, famously after trying all paths, his great message was Joto Mot Toto Pot, which in Bengali, that's Bengali, what it basically translates to is, as many as there are ways, there are paths to the divine. As many as there are ways, There are as many as there are opinions and ways, there are paths to reach God. I mean, if you think about it today, I mean, these were people living under British rule, you know, for them to have this spiritual depth, this clarity, this confidence is really awe-inspiring. The gender point, yes, people's own team is made up mostly of women, and Invest India has a majority of women employees. We celebrate that. We really celebrate that as a great idea, which has seeped into us from the culture of India, right? And I want to trace that idea back. You know, even what we do in Invest India for gender, I want to trace that idea back to Swami Vivekananda. People forget that Swami Vivekananda, some of his greatest pupils were women. And they were not even Indian women, they were Western women. Who paid for the land to be bought for the Belur Mutt to be established? Western women devotees of Swami Vivekananda. Who paid for the land in Mayavati, the hill in Mayavati in Uttarakhand, what we today call Uttarakhand, to be bought, and for that Advaita ashram, the world's only Advaita ashram, to be set up there, which Swami Vivekananda set up? Again, Western women devotees. Who was walking side by side with Swami Vivekananda and others when the plague came to Calcutta, going door to door, helping people? The person leading all that was Swami Vivekananda's perhaps his greatest devotee, Sister Nivedita, a Western woman, right? So Swami Vivekananda truly embraced this idea. I mean, he, you know, the lectures of his where he's in America and talking about the fact that unless the Western world can embrace the idea that men and women are not only at par, but in many ways women supersede men, there cannot be development. And it's so funny that we are talking about the glass ceiling even today in 2021, right? 150 years later. So Swami Vivekananda's great message of gender, and you know, I was talking to a Swamiji from the Ramakrishna Mission, a monk from the Ramakrishna Mission, just a couple of days ago, and we were talking about this, that even the word feminist, you know, some people say, oh, he was a great feminist. Yes, he was in some ways, but his ideas was far bigger than the limited word of feminism, right? He truly wanted the greatest kind of, and only today feminism is understanding those ideas. He said, men and women are equal, or rather, women are equal to men on their own terms, not by trying to become exactly like men, but as women, women are absolutely equal, if not better than men, right? That's that evolved idea of gender equality, which he had all those years ago, which we're only discovering only today in India and around the world.
Absolutely, you know, and one of the things that Swamiji said was, you know, if you are worshipping Shiva, and through that worship or inspired by that worship, you go and serve the rest of society, and especially the weakest, the poorest, or the socially most oppressed at that time, for example, women or certain communities. He says that actually Lord Shiva would be happier with you if rather than if you would see him only in temples. You should also see him in temples, but he says that is a preliminary stage. And I think that is also a very powerful and clear message that you know, this is very interesting. For at a self-help level, he always says, be stronger, do more, take one idea and let it possess you. But as I was saying, that's not an amoral Nietzschean kind of will to power sense, because when it comes to others, he immediately adds, serve the weak, serve the poor. So I think that combination of personal lack of victimhood, but helping others, including obviously in our society, women who have been historically not getting enough opportunities. And you're right about this kind of nuanced form of feminism, whereby of course they're equal, but as women, it's so, and same goes for men. They are also equal, but as men. So they are nonetheless differences, but they're the same. So I think again that it comes back to confidence, because these are things that people might perceive in their own lives, but to be able to say it requires a certain grounding.
Absolutely. I want to pick up on the thread that you just introduced in the conversation on seva. You know, Vivekananda's great idea, the idea that Ramakrishna Mission lives on even today, And I think many people don't know these things, so it's worth mentioning. After Swami Vivekananda, Ramakrishna Mission as an institution has always rejected power being concentrated in one monk. So it is truly a collective institution where monks are only allowed to work in one place or one geography for 3 or 4 years, and then they're shifted out again, right? So that you don't develop attachment or power to one institution. There's this wonderful story I want to share with everybody, including with you, Harsha. You, of course, in Calcutta might already know of this. There is this wonderful story told about a great Ramakrishna Mission monk, and this goes to the idea of seva, who spent many, many years fighting with the notorious Calcutta Municipal Corporation to ensure that the home where Swamiji grew up was properly, given, procured and made into a proper shrine and this. And then the day came when it was completely ready, and the dignitaries from around the world were going to come to inaugurate it. So the day before that, the next morning, the great inauguration was going to happen. Was shifted out and shifted to a really remote in the woods somewhere. And somebody asked, this man spent so many years of his life trying to bring this mission to its fruition and build this building and all of that. Why are you moving him out? And he very beautifully said, but his work is done. His work is done, right? He had a work to do. It's done. Now, whatever else that happens has nothing to do with him, right? And let us not forget, it is in the Ramakrishna Mission, in the tradition of Swami Vivekananda, that Swami Ranganathananda, one of the great leaders of the Ramakrishna Mission, was offered the Padma Vibhushan. And he famously said, I will accept it if the Padma Vibhushan is given to the Ramakrishna Mission. Of course, as you know, the Padma Awards are given to individuals and not to organizations, right? So, of course, as part of state policy, they told him, well, we can't really do that. We really want to give it to you. And you can then say that this is on behalf of and he refused to take it. He said, no, anything that celebrates me as an individual, I do not accept, because I am part of the whole, right? And that's why, this entire legacy of Swamiji, that's why, Ramakrishna Mission keeps talking about Doridro Narayan, right? I mean, you see Narayan, as it were, you see God in the poor, right? Which in a way is also a Gandhian ideal. Gandhiji said you must think in public policy about the last man, the poorest man, right? So these ideals have got embedded in the work that Swami Vivekananda did. And you're absolutely right. The wonderful thing about Swamiji is that he, of course, says you must be strong, but at the same time, he says you must care for the weak. You're on mute, Harsh.
Yes. I think it's very important that balance is there, because if you go too far to the self-pity side, can't help anybody. And if you're just obsessed with yourself, well, then you don't want to help anybody else. And it's like that if you're flying in the aeroplane, they say, well, the oxygen mask falls, first wear it yourself and then immediately help other people. So I think Swamiji had that sequencing absolutely right. What I want to ask you, Hindol, since you've written a book on Swamiji, is how do you see his, what some people call Neo Vedanta or Advaita Vedanta, and what message does that have for the youth of the world, but specifically Indian youth? Because in a way it is that kind of small U universalist message, but it can sound a bit too esoteric for some people. So how would you break it down for the youth of India specifically?
So I want to take a thread from what you were saying earlier, Harsh.
Okay.
Famous quote of Swamiji where he says, you might find actually God by playing football. Yeah. Let's pause for a moment and think about what he's really saying. He is saying, in the best possible case, that if you truly love doing something, yes. And you would have seen that, many painters feel this. Singers, when they sing, you feel that devotional song, they're not singing to an audience, they're singing directly to God, right? It's just incidental that the audience is there.
Right.
So, he's saying if you do something with all your heart and immerse yourself in a meditative way, because what is, after all, meditation? It is to, go deep and entirely with your entire being, get immersed in something, so that time, you lose any conception of time, right? So if you do that, and if you find that in football, which he loves playing himself, you're probably better off trying to find God through that mechanism than by going to temples.
No, I think it's fascinating because that reminds me of this wonderful thing that you mentioned, of a quote where he paraphrases the Bhagavad Gita and says, man should live like the lotus leaf, whereby he is in water, but does not get wet by that water. Yeah. And so he basically says, your man should live with his hand to work and his heart to God. And I think his main idea was focus on something and just totally surrender yourself to it. Yes. And that is how you find success, he said. So he was giving you the lalach of being successful while saying that you should actually not really care about it once you actually get it. It is a fascinating psychological message as well there for all of us, the youth.
And, in a sense, he lived that with his own life, right? I mean, yes. He passed away only at 39. Yes. And he could have lived on. The mission was growing. It was growing around the world. He could have, in a sense, savored its success. Yes. But in many ways, and he said this, right, that it's time for me to go. In a sense that Swamiji actually refused to, in the classic tradition that he had been taught in his spirituality, refused to benefit from what he had started, right? He had created the structure. He had taught people how to do it. And then he would let go, right? And I think that is such a great lesson. Yes, indeed, to do something with, I often say the only quote that most people know about Swami Vivekananda is arise, awake, and stop not until the goal is reached, right? Famous quote of Swami Vivekananda. But what is he really saying in that quote? He is saying that if you devote yourself to that one idea, as you were quoting him, and do it as if you're serving God, right? Yeah. The greatest musicians offer their music to God. We know in our tradition and in the Western tradition, some of the greatest writers offered their writing to God, yes. Poets and writers and so on and so forth, right? He was saying if you do your best and serve it to God as offering, success is just a worldly byproduct. It will come to you. You just have to devote your life entirely in this mission that your highest self, your highest creativity is devoted to God. And then the success that you seek will inevitably seep in and come. And when it comes, may you have the wisdom not to be trapped by it, which I think is the other great lesson.
So now we're just coming quickly to the present. There is obviously so much happening in the world's largest democracy, that is India. There is a lot of economic advance happening, but there is also a lot of religious disharmony, at least in public perception or in media, if not necessarily always on the ground. How would Swamiji kind of, thread this needle? How would he think about? Because I find it very interesting. He said at the closing remarks in the World Parliament of Religions, 1893, Chicago, that I pity the man who would want to exterminate all religions and only want his religion to kind of be sarve sarva and all of it. So how would you think about it?
So I think if Swamiji had he been alive today, his message and his guru's message really, that Joto Moth Toto Poth is more relevant for us than ever before. See, Harsh, I mean, I have written about it. We have spoken about it. Many people have considered it. We are really moving into a world where technology will dramatically change our very self. Swamiji, in a sense, saw that, when he spoke. And he's among the few monks who ever considered science and technology. And, at a time when religion was always dismissive of even Darwin's theory of evolution or other scientific things. Swamiji said, no, any religion which does not embrace science does not deserve to remain alive, right? So essentially what he's saying is that no matter what science brings up, my religion and my spiritual ideas and philosophy should be so powerful that they should be able to accommodate all of that effortlessly. Otherwise, if that's not true, then what is the great philosophy that I'm offering to the world, right? So I think he would be very excited among to see the scientific transformation of our very minds and bodies that is happening already and will happen much more rapidly in the future. Somebody asked me one day, would Swamiji embrace social media? I think yes, he would probably be a prolific tweeter. He was a prolific lecture giver, so he's probably going to be a prolific tweeter. But jokes apart, I think his guru's ideal, which he spread around the world, that at the end of the day, as long as mankind cannot understand that different people approach the divine in different ways, quite like everybody feels love for their parents, but there are obviously distinctions between parent to parent and child to child, right? So unless this distinction is not understood, and unless it is not understood that while different sets of parents the sets of children may love their parents, but there's also a universal thread through it all, which is love that a child feels for the parent. Exactly the same way, love that human beings or devotion that human beings feel for the almighty, divine, superpower, whatever you want to call it, right? As many as there are ways, as many as there are opinions, there are ways and paths to find the divine. If this is not understood by human beings, and I think it is increasingly being understood because there is no choice anymore, or we are not in a space where people can eliminate each other and so on and so forth. And imagine what that would mean. It would mean worldwide bloodshed. So I think that's why I feel that instead of people quarreling, I think Swamiji's message is more and more important for us to embrace. Because if we can only imagine how wonderful a world would be, if we can imagine that, you and I, for instance, Harsh, have very similar interests in history and culture and economics, but we are still different people.
Yes.
And we will find our own answers, right? Same way, we are different people, and our paths to finding the divine might take a different shape and form. The divine might be the same, but our paths the roots might be different. If we understand that so much of bloodshed, so much of conversion-related bloodshed, all kinds of things, blasphemy-related bloodshed, all of that would stop in the world.
Absolutely. I think Swamiji's guru, Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, he said that if you see water and somebody calls it water, somebody calls it jal, somebody calls it pani, having three different words does not change the underlying substance. And that obviously comes an idea from the Rig Veda itself, right? It's a very intrinsically Indian dharmic or Vedic idea, that kind of universalism, but non-homogenizing universalism. It's a universalism that is at peace with harmony. And when I was just going through Swamiji's speeches, the word harmony comes so often. I mean, the only other people who use it, and I would say misuse it, is the Chinese Communist Party. But let's not get sidetracked there. So I think it's very interesting that Swamiji mentions the word harmony so many times. And in Chicago, he says, we have to come up with that universal idea. And which is why he was a superstar of the 1893, as you're saying. There were Harvard professors there, and here was this guy from a colonized country. And he said, how do we approach the same divine in multiple ways? And how do we conceptualize that? And that is something that, I think to people like you and me and a lot of Indians, it might seem like common sense, but that remains a revolutionary idea in the broader world. And I think the import of that, the way he mentioned it, is very important for the youth to inculcate, because obviously people who have a different view of older generations, it's difficult to change, but at least the younger generations can inculcate that.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think we would have to, right? Because see, technology in the coming times, as Swamiji himself, in a sense, foresaw in his embrace of technology and science, technology will begin to really, and is already making us question many of the enforced boundaries that we live in, right?
Yes.
In a world of the metaverse, what would the nation state mean? We don't know, right? We don't know what it would do to our brains and our very idea of identity. You know what I
Exactly.
mean? So these are going to be very relevant questions in our lifetime, in the next 10 years, 20 years, right? And all of these ideas will then make us see, human beings will always need an inner life. I am of the firm belief that as long as human existence will go on, and indeed this is true in history, as long as human existence has existed, human beings have always needed an inner life. But that inner life has to become harmonious rather than divisive.
Right.
Search for an inner life has to be harmonious. You know, His Holiness the Dalai Lama famously was once asked, "What is Buddhism?" You know, I don't know anything about Buddhism. What is Buddhism? And he famously said, "You don't need to understand anything. You don't need to understand the noble paths and all the great scriptures, nothing. You don't even need to understand the Buddha himself." He said, "You just understand that Buddhism is compassion. It is
Yes.
kindness, right? To be a Buddhist is to be kind." So I was giving a lecture, after one of my books was won an award in America. So I was doing a book tour, and somebody asked me, "So then what is Hinduism?" Right? And I put to you that, to me at least, and I've said it many times, Hinduism is joy. It's Satchit Ananda. It is the idea that every human being, whether Hindu or not, has the capability to find bliss within them, right? But this bliss, Harsh, I put to you, cannot be found as long as human beings think in divisive ways. As long as we look at one another and say, "Oh, you are not like me, you are different because of this." So this divisiveness, unless it ends, we will not find bliss. And
Hence the beautiful name Vivekananda,
yes, right, right.
just to add to your point.
A blissful soul, right? So
Exactly.
I think truly, as technology unites us, so should our inner life. And I think that we can learn from Vivekananda, Harsh.
And in fact, he, if I'm not wrong, inspired the creation of the Indian Institute of Science.
Absolutely.
And which is obviously even today the premier institute of pure scientific research in India. And of course, J.R.D. Tata was the person, the moving force behind it. But it shows that in Indic thought, or in Vivekananda's worldview, that science and what we call religion, or at least our understanding of religion, are not orthogonal to each other. They are in many ways fulfilling each other. As you briefly mentioned, Charles Darwin, which kind of created a massive earthquake in a particular literalist worldview. In our worldview, people are always surprised looking at young female ISRO scientists, or men and women of Indian origin in NASA, and there is the Murti of Ganeshji behind that person, and people are like, "How does this make sense?" Because for them, a rocket scientist cannot worship the gods, whereas in this worldview, they are very much fulfilling each other. And I think that your message we're discussing modernity, you mentioned technology, which is accelerating. And I agree with you, it will further accelerate and create all kinds of opportunities and some dislocations. And therefore, this message, in the Western context, therefore, the spiritual but not religious designation is becoming more and more common, because they need that inner harmony, as you were very beautifully saying, without necessarily getting trapped in literalist dogma. And I think Swami Vivekananda's message, is in a way one of the ways. Of course, he comes from a long line. We are not saying that it is just him. He himself would never say that. But it is very fascinating that how, as you were saying, what does the nation state remain in this world of the metaverse 10 years from now, and how we are all becoming one global family while retaining our individual identities. What would that mean? It is something which is open-ended, and perhaps for all of us to decide.
And that indeed, Harsh, was the great flaw of globalization 20, 30 years ago. The Tom Friedman version of globalization, and Swamiji, his economic ideas, in a sense, foresaw this. See, this Tom Friedman idea of globalization is like a road roller. It basically says that once everybody starts eating McDonald's and wearing Levi's jeans, they'll all become the same. That's fundamentally incorrect. We know it is incorrect, right? It just makes no sense. India has a much better idea of globalization. Vivekananda has a much better idea of globalization.
Yes.
Which is you remain individual,
Yes.
but are able to see the best that you have within you in everybody else.
Yeah, and I think it should not be surprising that this idea comes from India, because amongst the old world or the known world, when Americas was not known to the rest of humanity, India is literally at the geographical center. We were always influenced by currents from East Asia, Southeast Asia, West Asia, Central Asia, Europe, Africa, through the seas, through the mountains. And we, in a way, much more than perhaps other ancient and great civilizations, were forced to live with diversity, and we made that a positive as opposed to something that we had to put up with. And therefore, the concept of mutual respect and not just tolerance. And therefore, I think it is important to say that Swamiji, while having this very universalist view, said that nonetheless, if you do change into an orthodox literalist homogenizing view, then he was not afraid of calling you one friend less and one enemy more. I think that should also be put in the public domain. So there was not a sense of appeasement, but there was a sense of realist compassion. And I think just one last point, which I think you very beautifully mentioned about Buddhism. Swamiji says that one of the reasons for the downfall of India for the last 1,000 years, of course, in a very larger time context, he said was the decoupling of what he called Buddhist thought and Hindu thought, or he used the word Brahmin thought, saying that, we need the brain and the heart to work together. And which is where we kind of lost that organic touch is where, because he was always very thinking not just about spirituality, but spirituality and society. In a way, foreshadowing Ambedkar, who said that, man is not for religion, but religion is for man.
Yes.
So spirituality is something that we exist for, but religion is a broader social context which has to be created for us as well. And I think that, in a way, but without the kind of, in a very harmonious sense. And I think we still haven't really read Swamiji properly, and I would include partially myself in that category. So more of us need to read your book, Hindol.
Thank you, Harsha, and you're absolutely right. And as we come to the end, more or less, of our time, I want to leave this thought and this illustrative example of how this, in his own lifetime, what Swami Vivekananda did to promote these ideas that we've been discussing now for nearly 1 hour. Swami Vivekananda, it is no secret that his guru was Ramakrishna Paramhans, right? An unlettered, so to speak, village man, but totally devoted to the goddess Kali and so on and so forth. When Swami Vivekananda built the Advaita Ashram, not Belur Math, Advaita Ashram in Mayavati, he said this is going to be even more special. Why? Because Advaita Ashram is entirely non-denominational. He refused to put the image of his own guru also. In fact, there were people around him who objected, saying, and went to the Holy Mother, the spiritual consort of Sri Ramakrishna, who was still alive at that time, and saying, oh, look what Naren is doing. He's not putting Thakur, the Sri Ramakrishna's photo also in Mayavati. And she said, Naren knows what he's doing. Don't worry about that, right? Because he said, today, if you go to Mayavati, Harsh, and I urge you to go someday, there is nothing there. There is no denominational. It is devoted, as Swamiji said, to the worship and contemplation on the absolute truth and the truth alone, which has no denomination, no shape, no form. You're supposed to go there and meditate upon the idea of absolute truth, which does not leave anybody aside, which does not cut away anybody. And I put to you that in his own lifetime, through his own practice, he showed the path. He showed a path that would go beyond, structures and dimensions and embrace the largest number of people possible. And I put to you that there is something to learn from that.
No, I think I would just end by saying that he obviously created a long line of thinkers and holy men after him, who have lived not just in India but around the world. and not just through the Ramakrishna mission, but even more broader. And it is very incumbent upon us to, while retaining our individual identity, to think in those universalist terms, that in at least the superstructure should be non-denominational. And I would absolutely look forward to go to that ashram very soon, Advaita Ashram in Uttarakhand. Thank you very much for that advice, because it is the only way out. And I think Swamiji, his message for the youth: do something, be strong, take care of the weak. At the same time, do not get involved in denominational fanaticism. I think that comprehensive message, be your hand at work and heart at God, like the lotus leaf, do not get wet. I think that is the takeaway which I take away from him, and I look forward to think more about his works. Thank you, Hindol. Love talking to you as always.
No, wonderful talking to you, Harsh, and a lovely, lovely conversation. Really enjoyed our conversation. And indeed, as you say, to conclude, Swamiji's great message was that if you truly want to, reach the divine in any shape or form, number one, you cannot start by dividing human beings from each other. Number two, unless you have an element of service, unless you're able to selflessly give, the path to the divine might be tougher than what you imagine. I think these two great lessons of not being selfish and not dividing human beings from one another are two great lessons we can all imbibe in our personal lives. And I think that would be greatly beneficial for all of us. But on that note, thank you very much for a wonderful audience, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you, Harsh. Thank you very much for joining me in this wonderful conversation. I'm going to pass it back to our wonderful anchor now to wrap up the session. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much, gentlemen. Those are carefully selected insights that you've shed light on, and they aligned perfectly with the topic. Thank you so very much for your time, and wishing you both a very good luck for the future. Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude this session, it is important that the youth of the nation focuses on not being selfish and being friends with each other and growing together through participation at your own pace. With the same, thank you very much for joining us for this session. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall begin with the next session at sharp 3 p.m. We'll be taking a break for the lunch. Thank you so very much. Well, my sincerest apologies for the miscommunication. We shall join back for the next session at sharp 2 p.m. We are now taking a break for the lunch. We shall see you back in the conference room for the next session at sharp 2 p.m.